Welcome to Pidja Podcast.
I strongly encourage the resumption of dialogue between the government of the People's Republic of China and His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives on meaningful autonomy.
Now, Uzra Zeya is an Indian origin diplomat who has worked in the State Department for 27 years. The United States has named Under Secretary Uzra Zeya as the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues.
Why is the work you're doing important?
Martin Luther King, who once said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I want you to know that you're not alone. You know, you have the government of the United States, you have the U.S. Congress, you have other like-minded governments around the world who want to help you not only preserve those traditions, but we want you to be able to pass them on to future generations, really to the benefit of the world at large.
Undersecretary Zeya, this is such an honor and privilege for us for you to come on the Pidja podcast, the Tibetan Tea podcast. We really appreciate this.
Well, Tashidelik, Tenzin, the honor is mine as well. I'm really happy to meet you and just to have a chance to have a conversation today.
Thank you. First, I want to start off with just having our audience understand what you do.
Sure.
So, can you explain the vast and simply what is it that you do?
Sure. Well, I'm very honored to be the United States Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, and that is a role that I have carried now for nearly 2.5 years. I was named by Secretary Blinken in December 2021, but it's a little bit of a unique role as well in that I am also concurrently the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Civilian Security. So I have twin responsibilities of strengthening democracy, supporting universal rights, advancing human-centered security all over the world, and at the same time, I have a very special responsibility as special coordinator for Tibetan issues, where I work with a dedicated team to advance the human rights of Tibetans inside Tibet and diaspora communities all over the world. Two, I work to help preserve and support the preservation of the unique cultural, linguistic, and religious identity of Tibetans. Three, I strongly encourage the resumption of dialogue between the government of the People's Republic of China and His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives on meaningful autonomy. Four, I advocate for increased access to the Tibetan Autonomous Region and Tibetan areas where we've seen a real decrease in that access for diplomats, for journalists, for Tibetan Americans, and for the world at large in recent years. The fifth aspect of my mandate is basically focusing on the environmental and water resources dimension with respect to the Tibetan Plateau, in that over 1 billion people are dependent on this for a source of water and life itself. And sixth and finally, I have a humanitarian mandate in terms of helping meet the humanitarian needs of Tibetan refugees, and particularly in India and Nepal, where this population is concentrated. So, it's a multifaceted mission in my role as special coordinator, but it's one that I don't do alone. We work very closely with religious, civil society leaders, with Tibetan community leaders, with the Central Tibetan Administration, and also with, I would say, bipartisan champions on this issue set in the U.S. Congress, which created my mandate as special coordinator for Tibetan issues many years ago.
Right. Why is the work you're doing important?
Well, I think it's important because we are witnessing, an ongoing effort by the PRC to suppress, the most basic human rights of Tibetans, and there are over 6 million Tibetans in China. The right to honor their religious leaders, the right to display a photo of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, the right to practice their religion and celebrate their religious traditions, their right to venerate and select their leaders. And, you know, as Martin Luther King once said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So certainly I am very committed to this mandate, you know, focused on human rights, focused on cultural preservation, focused on humanitarian relief, and thankfully we're not alone. We work with dedicated partners in the U.S. Congress, in civil society, and among Tibetan leaders all over the world.
Right. Before we jump into your role as Special Coordinator and Undersecretary, at the beginning of these podcasts, I really try to contextualize who you are, who our guest is.
Sure, sure.
So, you know, our audience sees the Undersecretary, the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues.
Right.
What were the most important moments in your early childhood that led you to become the person you are today?
Well, you know, I would say I think my identity as a second-generation American, as an American of Indian heritage, definitely plays a big role in who I am today and where I am today. So I grew up in North Carolina. I was the first member of my family, which is now an extended family, born in the United States. My parents immigrated to the U.S. from India in the 1960s. And, you know, I grew up in a university town, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, later Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You know, great areas where actually there was not a really large South Asian American community. So I grew up in a house, a bilingual household where, you know, of course English was spoken, but also my parents spoke Urdu. Okay. And,
do you speak Urdu?
Bahut thodi si. But I understand it. Right. I can understand Hindi. I think, you know, the influence of my parents and my relatives definitely made me interested in what was happening in the world. I became interested in learning foreign languages. I started Spanish in elementary school. I was interested in history, learning more about the world, model United Nations. I decided when it was time for me to go to college to try for Georgetown and the School of Foreign Service because there was something, even though I was not, you know, a very well-traveled person, you know, I would say my background kind of gave me a window and an interest in what was happening well beyond my community and the rest of the world. So I decided to pursue a degree at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service and international politics and diplomacy. I had the opportunity to study abroad in Cairo, Egypt, and that for me was another game-changing formative experience. It was the first time in my life I lived abroad as an American. I was able to really deepen my study of Arabic and improve, you know, being surrounded in a more of an immersion experience. And that experience, you know, relatively young, still in my teens, was very formative in my desire to be able to represent the United States, because I find as an American abroad, you represent the United States. You know, you are challenged. You have to explain what our country is about, who we are. I found that experience actually very invigorating, but also combined with a desire to try to close gaps of understanding, to try to build bridges. And quite honestly, those experiences are what really propelled me to take the Foreign Service exam and to join the State Department relatively young, soon after I graduated. And 30 plus years later, here I am.
So Georgetown over UNC, I'm guessing?
Yes, but I am a UNC basketball fan to this day.
Got it. I think your story is something that our audience would resonate with. Second-generation Americans, Tibetan refugees, they grew up here. A lot of them are also interested in service. I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere that you were one of the youngest members of the Foreign Service when you joined. Is that true?
At the time, way back then, I'm dating myself in 1990, they told me I was the youngest member of the Foreign Service at the time. And here's the thing, a lot of people may not realize about the U.S. Department of State. You can join this Department of State as a Foreign Service officer from the age of 20 to 59 and a half. And we cover such a broad spectrum of issues and responsibilities. I think many may think that you need to have a classic international relations background, you know, what I pursued when I was at university, but in fact, we are looking for people with expertise across the spectrum, and I would say these days, particularly in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, you know, we are living through a digital transformation of everything. You know, we are grappling with transnational challenges that know no borders, climate disruption, global pandemics. We need people who are ready to roll up their sleeves and solve problems, but also represent our country in all of its diversity, which I think is, again, one of America's greatest strengths.
Right. Were there any particular challenges that you think you had to overcome, any adversities, and how those shaped, you know, again, going back to my initial question, how those shaped who you are today?
Well, you know, I would say early on in my career, and this is something I've talked and written about, you know, I didn't see a lot of people who look like me when I joined the State Department way back when, over 30 years ago. But thankfully, I think we've had a concerted effort across the last 3 decades to, you know, recruit a State Department that looks more like America. And, you know, I want to point out here that the Foreign Service is not the only entry track in the State Department. We have a civil service, which is primarily domestically based, which really forms the backbone of department work here in Washington and works all over the country on everything from passport issuance to diplomatic security investigations, uncovering human traffickers, other you know, fraud or mismanagement with respect to passport applications. It's an incredibly complex, multifaceted mission, but a lot of people don't realize that the State Department might be working in their hometown, you know, with a diplomatic security office or a consular affairs passport office, which help Americans from all walks of life connect with the rest of the world.
Opportunities are everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Multifaceted, you mentioned complex. Your role as Undersecretary of, was it Civilian Security,
Democracy, and Human Rights.
Wow. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, it is a broad spectrum of issues that cover the gamut from human rights and universal human rights. And what does that mean? That means supporting freedom of expression, freedom of association, equality and equity for vulnerable and marginalized groups, women and girls, LGBTQI plus persons, religious and ethnic minorities, and in some cases you have oppressed majorities who are unable to exercise fundamental human rights that perhaps we as Americans might take for granted. You know, the ability to speak our mind, the ability to elect our leaders and hold them accountable, the ability to form organizations and try to contribute to societal progress. But there's also civilian security, and I often refer to this as human security. These are issues like access to justice, transitional justice in societies that are recovering from armed conflict or recovering from authoritarianism, counter-narcotics, rule of law, anti-corruption, fighting human trafficking, human smuggling. Other areas, humanitarian issues, supporting safe, humane migration, supporting refugees. You know, a lot of people may not realize, but the United States is the world's leading host in welcoming refugees all over the world, and that's an area of responsibility that I prioritize. We are proud to be the world's leading humanitarian donor, supporting vulnerable communities all over the world, including Tibetan refugees, but certainly not limited to that. So, you know, my remit as Undersecretary is broad, it's global, but I think it gets to the heart of American values, who we are, what we represent as a country.
And your role as Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, you know, from my perspective, I see you really involved within not just the Tibetan leadership, but also the Tibetan community, which, you know, I do really appreciate. From your perspective, how do you think it's going so far in these past 2 years, 3 years now?
Sure, it's been about 2.5 years, and you know, I'm heartened, and I'm determined. And Tenzin, you know, one of the biggest motivators for me, where I draw inspiration, is the resilience of Tibetans themselves.
Absolutely.
You know, young leaders like you doing this podcast. You know, I've had the privilege in my role as Undersecretary and Special Coordinator to travel all over the world, and I've met Tibetan American diaspora communities here in the United States, but also abroad in countries like India and Nepal, and I see a determination to persevere, to preserve your unique and cherished religious, linguistic, cultural traditions. And I want you to know that you're not alone. You know, you have the government of the United States, you have the U.S. Congress, you have other like-minded governments around the world who want to help you not only preserve those traditions, but we want you to be able to pass them on to future generations, really to the benefit of the world at large.
Right. Well, why do you think that's important to the United States government?
Well, I think it's important because, you know, as I said earlier, you know, we have a global remit on human rights, and you know, I think that what we've been able to do over decades through this role as a special coordinator is help shine a light, you know, on what is happening in Tibet with, you know, more recently, really an intensification of what is often called Sinicization efforts, you know, efforts to really impose the Chinese language, erode and suppress religious practice, even the use of the Tibetan language. There's been a lot of really important work done, including in the United Nations, as well as in the NGO community, shining a light on the phenomenon of so-called boarding schools, where nearly 1 million children have been forcibly separated from their families, not allowed to speak the Tibetan language, and you know, it's an attempt to really indoctrinate and alter the identity of Tibetan Buddhism as we know it.
Yeah. We got some breaking news earlier this week.
Okay.
His Holiness is coming to the United States. For many of us, it's a bittersweet feeling. He's coming for knee surgery or knee treatment, but at the same time, he's coming to our home, America. What were your first thoughts, and do you think His Holiness will be able to meet Secretary Blinken or President Biden?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, we welcome His Holiness's private visit to the United States, and you know, for any details on that, you'd really have to go to the office of His Holiness. But you know, I myself have had the honor to have an audience with His Holiness twice in India, and while I don't have any information to share, Tenzin, with respect to his program, I would say that, you know, there's a long tradition of U.S. officials being received by His Holiness, and that is, you know, another aspect of my mandate, but it's also part of American diplomacy.
And then quickly, what's your analysis on the the Tibetan-China issue. What's your outlook? What's your forecast? What do Tibetan Americans, Tibetan youth need to do for a better outlook, you think?
Well, looking at the different dimensions of my mandate, certainly the United States will continue to shine a light on the human rights abuses that are being perpetrated against Tibetans as we speak, and the different dimensions of that. I would commend to you our annual reports on human rights, which are viewed by many as the gold standard for human rights reporting in the world, but also our international religious freedom reports. We will be soon releasing the latest international religious freedom reports for the world in coming weeks. But, we'll continue also to call for a resumption of dialogue, which sadly has been suspended now for some 13 years. We'll continue to provide substantial humanitarian relief to refugee communities. And we're going to continue to elevate the issue, the environmental and water resource dimensions. And to this end, I think we were heartened to work with international partners to do a very meaningful event last year at Stockholm Water Week that helped elevate international awareness and we hope cooperation on this issue.
And for Tibetan youth and Americans?
Well, for Tibetan youth, I would encourage Tibetan youth to continue their own educational attainment. I think you are a great example of that, but I've really been heartened myself to meet many other dynamic and really extraordinary Tibetan American students like yourselves. Just yesterday, we hosted the Tibetan Youth Leaders Program, a fantastic program that brings together Tibetan Americans from all over the country to really help support their professional advancement. At the Department of State, as part of our broad support efforts, we're very proud to support the Tibetan Scholars Program. And this is something administered by our Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And I think well over 400 Tibetans from all over the world have pursued advanced study in the United States that they are carrying back to elevate their own communities at home. And this is not just in fields like human rights and international affairs, but everything from environmental science to STEM fields. And I've met actually a number of alumni of the Tibetan Scholars Program who are now senior officials in the Central Tibetan Administration. So I think these are examples where we see the educational attainment and striving of Tibetan exiles really giving back to their own communities.
That's wonderful.
And I would encourage you to consider the State Department for the Tibetan Americans among you. We're proud to have Tibetan Youth Leader Program alumni in our own Department of State, representing us to really the entire world.
All right. Undersecretary, I think we'll leave it there on a message of hope. Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tenzin. It's been my pleasure, and more power to you with this podcast, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great.